Thank you, everybody. It's such a pleasure to see you all here tonight and see a lot of familiar faces. That's always a very nice thing. So some of this I know the question to. How many of you have some experience in music? Fantastic. How many of you have experience in numbers? All right. Well, we should be able to find something that works for both of you here to a certain degree. Arnold Schoenberg was a very interesting character. He's probably one of the more influential composers that we've had in the 20th century now in the past tense, had in the 20th century. For mainly the reason that he created a very systematic and regimented way of composing music without a tonal center, atonal music. And in fact, his mind when he did that was, the idea was, I'm going to bring German to the forefront, German music to the forefront, and my style of music is going to last for 100 years. Didn't quite happen like that. However, still remained very influential to a lot of later composers who came along. We still have composers that compose in the same style that he did, as well as new ways of looking at analyzing modern music that come a lot from the type of work that he did. So taking a look a little bit at Arnold Schoenberg, he is an Austrian composer. He was born in 1874. He started taking violin lessons when he was 8 years old and started composing shortly thereafter. He didn't really have any formal training until he reached his teens. For purposes of what's important to our discussion, in 1898 he actually abandoned his Jewish faith and converted to Lutheranism for quite a while. In 1908, his early music actually started out very much in the sense of our later Romantic composers. You see some influences actually from Brahms, from Wagner, from Mahler, things that had a very strong tonal center. And in fact, let me play you one of his early works called Lieder. And just to give you a sense that he wrote actually some very beautiful tonal music. Really some beautiful music. And yes, on a music history exam, if I listened to this, I would not pick Arnold Schoenberg for this. But he actually started writing very tonal music, which is very much in the style of the Romantic composers of the time. In 1908, though, he rather felt that the German composers, Romantic composers, had pushed the limits about as far as they could go. And so he decided that he wanted to break the bonds of tonality, if you will. And in 1908, he started writing his first atonal works. These are tonal works without, works without any kind of a tonal center. And for those of you who may not be quite so familiar with that, usually when we play music, how many of you have ever played Heart and Soul on the piano? Learn to play. That gets a lot, yes. And there's a very strong sense that we are progressing in a certain fashion. And if I were to stop right here, you would want to hear it resolve back to that. So that is tonal music. The fact that you've got harmonies that go into a progression that are leading back to a state of resolution, if you will. Well, he got rid of all of that. Basically, he really broke the bounds of that. He did become a teacher at the Prussian Academy of the Arts, however, in Berlin. However, in 1933, he was forced to leave Germany, as so many other Jewish composers and artists were, at the time that Hitler was elected chancellor, as you go. And so he went originally to Paris, and at that time, on July 24th, 1933, he reconverted to Judaism again before he left the United States. He came to the United States, moved out to LA, and taught at UCLA from 1936 until 1945 when he had a heart attack and he stopped teaching at that point and then died in 1951. However, we'll see with a lot of his works, again, this is a 12-tone composition that we're really going to take a look at. And a lot of his later works, with him kind of converting back to Judaism, he wrote a lot of works. His three last choral works were based on Jewish texts. And he wrote a number of music that kind of fit along those lines. So the one that we're going to take a look at is Dreimal, Tausend, Jahre. Now, for those of you who don't know how a 12-tone composition works, basically you take the octave and you divide it into a series of half steps. So you've got 12 tones going on there. And his idea basically is that it's sort of the ultimate democracy of music in the fact that each note is going to get equal weight now. You're going to avoid a tonal center by giving each pitch an equal weight. For the sake of what we're doing here, actually a lot of times when we are talking about these scales, we'll actually number them 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Oops, sorry, that actually goes back to 0. Never mind that. Good, because that's the same tone, except all the way down. And so we'll refer to numbers almost as much as we will refer to letters as we go along here. So the idea behind a 12-tone composition is that you create a scale based on those 12 tones without any sort of tone repeating. And the neat thing about that, and it can be in any order, as we go through that, I'll play some of the tone rows that he uses. The neat thing about it is you can then manipulate it. So the prime row, let's say that is our initial row. That's the prime row. Now I can play it backwards, retrograde. So I start with the last note and work my way forward. Or I can play it what is basically upside down, where instead of going up by that half step, I go down. Or I can play that backwards. So it gives him a lot of leeway as far as what he can do with the various tone rows that he chooses to use. By the way, if anybody has any questions or wants any clarification as we're going along, please feel free to ask as we go through. I'd be happy to do that. So we're looking at one of his works called Dreimal, Tausend, Jahre. It was written in 1949, so it was 2 years before he died. It's based on the text called Gottes Wiederkehr, which means God's return. It was written in 1948, celebrating the establishment of the State of Israel at that point by a fellow by the name of Dagobert David Runes. He wrote it originally in 3 quatrains, so 3 stanzas of 4 lines each. The first stanza basically talking about the destruction of the temple, the second stanza talking about the hope of a new land, and then the third celebrating God's return. So again, putting this in the context of the new state of Israel as we go through that. Here's what the text actually says. 3 times 1,000 years since I have seen you, temple of Jerusalem, temple of my grief, and you, waves of Jordan, silver strip of desert, gardens and countryside are greening a new shore. And we hear it ringing softly from the hills, your completely forgotten song announcing God's return. Now you may ask yourself, well, those are not quatrains, those are couplets. Well, when Schoenberg adapted this to the piece that he was going to write, he changed it into 3 series of couplets, and we can talk about that significance in a moment. You also notice a couple of words that I have in parentheses. He changed, those are words that he changed. The original words were rustling and whispering, and he wanted something a little bit more demonstrative there, so he actually changed the text as we go through that. Throughout this, we're going to see a number of elements of return as we talk about this, sort of the personal, historic elements of his return to Judaism in 1933, Schoenberg's, and of course in 1948, the foundation of the State of Israel at that point. We're also going to see that element of return reflected in some of the musical elements of the piece. How the tone row, that scale, the 12-tone scale, is formed. How he creates the melody and manipulates it. The idea of pitch centers, and I put that in quotation marks because it is an atonal piece, but there are some nods to going back to some tonal centers, if you will. The form of the piece, and again, harmonic implications as we go through that. So some of the numerical symbolism that we are going to see, 6 is going to be a very, very important number as we go through here. Of course, 6 points on the Star of David. There are 6 lines of text now that he's turned it from quatrains to couplets. He uses hexachords, which means he's going to take that 12-tone row and he's going to split it in half. And he's just going to use half of it at a time in some spots. So you've got 6 notes that he's dealing with. Time signature is 6/4, so we have 6 pulses per measure, if you will. He makes use of the tritone. For those of you who know what the tritone is, it is a very unstable interval. However, it is also splits the octave in half. But it has a very sense of dissonance. You want to hear it resolve. There we go. That's a proper resolution. You want to hear it resolve back to that as you go with that. And that happens to be the 6th half step of the scale. So that plays an important role in what we're dealing with here. Also, the proportion of the sections. It gets progressively longer. There are 3 sections of the piece, 1 for each of those stanzas. And they get progressively longer. The second one is to that proportion, 1 to 2 to 3, if you will. And first section is 4 measures long, second section is 8 measures long, final section is 12 measures long. Tell you the truth, honestly, it's 13, but it's because it ties the final chord over to the downbeat of the next bar. So we're counting it as 12 for this. Interestingly enough, if you take 1 by 2 by 3, multiply it by the 4 directions of the row manipulation, you end up with that number of measures. And of course, you have the 12 tribes of Israel that work into that. We're going to find some musical symbolism as we look at this piece. There are going to be certain patterns and certain elements that he uses to represent God, to represent the new shore, which in this case is Israel, to represent the human struggle, and ultimately the return of God. And with the return of God, we're going to see all of the culmination of a number of elements. So, the moment we've been waiting for, our tone row, on which he bases this piece. He's going to use 2 tone rows. He's got it, the prime form, by the way, can be transposed. All of this can be transposed. So he's going to use a prime form starting on the 7 note classification, pitch classification, if you will. He's also going to use an inverted form of the tone row starting on 0. And he will use the retrogrades of these, and these are what he's going to build his composition on. Again, I put the numbers so you can tell sort of what scale degrees you've got here, and you'll notice going across that there is no number that duplicates itself. If you were to invert this directly, this is the numerical system we would end up with. And what I mean when I talk about invert, whereas this adds 2 half steps going here, you subtract 2 half steps here. Subtract 3, add 3. So that's basically how that's going to work across as we go through that. And then to get it to the 0 level, you just subtract 7 out of each of those. And that will get you to the inverted scale. So, just in case you're wondering what that sounds like, P7 is, first hexachord, and then you have, I'm sorry, I can't read upside down. There we go, something more along like that. He doesn't use P7B very often, at least as far as what we're going to discuss. And then, of course, that gets inverted by the lower part. And again, you can kind of hear the contrary motion as you go through that. So he makes a lot of use, particularly of these first chords. And if you look at these sets of chords, first of all, you'll see that I0 and P7, they end with that unstable tritone that we talked about. Sorry. So it's a very unstable sound. Versus the end of P7B and I0B, which end with, excuse me, which is a much more stable fifth. That's what we base eventually our triads on as we go through that. That too is going to play in some of what he is doing as we go along here. Now, if you take a look at P7A and I0A, what do you notice if you look at the numbers? Do you see any duplication? No. This is another little trick that he decided to throw into the mix. And we've seen a lot of his music after 1928, and we talked about this. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention about the characteristics of that row is if you look at the first hexachord here, you're actually going to have 5 of the 6 notes out of a G major scale. If you look at I0, you're going to have 5 of the 6 elements of an A flat major scale. So again, that's going to offer the opportunity of creating some sort of tonal centers as we go through that. But what we were talking about there not being any duplication between P7A and I0A, is called inversional combinatoriality. And yes, my friends, that is a real word. Although it's spitted out every time I try to put it, the spell check didn't like it one bit. But it is a true term. And basically the fact that all 12 pitches are represented with the combination of those 2 hexachords. And in addition, I0A is an inversion of P7A. So you've got the inversional combinatoriality. And this is what he chooses. The combination of P7A and I0A is what he uses to create the soprano melody. Sopranos, you're going to love it. So yes, what you end up with is only he does a few more interesting things with it. Now, if you put those 2 hexachords together, you actually see a little bit of return in the melody, in the fact that we've got that strong center from G to C, which is what we talked about with Heart and Soul, the fact that you, and that's that G to C that we're looking for. So you see, as we go from one hexachord to another, we go from that G to that C. And he does it in such a way of what we call the leading tone. So that even adds to that sense of feeling it go from G to C. And then you'll note on the very last note is an A flat, which is going to send us right back to the G at the beginning. So that really creates a sense of almost there being a bit of a G-C tonal center as we go through that. Now, to make this even more interesting and to add more to this idea of return, as if that weren't already offering quite a bit of it, he then presents each hexachord as a palindrome. So you go through, he goes through the 6 notes of the P7A hexachord, and then he reverses order and goes back to the beginning of that hexachord. So that you have it returns back to the note that it started on. And then the same thing with the second hexachord. So we're going to have that as well going in there. And that idea of sort of repeating these center pitches, which are then going to lead back to the C there, and then back to the G ultimately. So you've got very strongly, again, that C to G movement. We're going to see return in the form of the piece, and this is just a general breakdown. We'll go through each section separately in a moment. It is in 3 sections based on the stanzas of the text. The first section is the destruction of the temple and longing for God. So what we're going to find here is the use of P7, which had P7A, which has that movement from G to C, and also this use of palindromes. We're going to see in B, there is no mention of God. So we are not going to use any of P7, and we are not going to use palindromes. And we're going to move to an A-flat pitch center. We're going to use those rows that go more around the A-flat pitch center, if you will. And then finally, with the return of God, we're going to have the return of P7 and the palindromes, and the pitch center is returning predominantly to this G-C axis, if you will. So we've got textual and compositional similarities between the outer sections with a contrast on the intersection. And the fact that there is no P7 here and no mention of God here is going to begin to inform us that the role of P7 has to do with the representation of God. So starting at the very first section, we've got the destruction of the temple. And again, I just showed you the soprano melody. And honestly, once the soprano melody finishes that's the end of the 4 measures, and that's the end of the first section. It's just 4 measures long. But again, you're going to see this use of P7A and I0A hexachords, the use of palindromes, the GC pitch centers, and therefore the implications of God in text, but yet mourning his absence, if you will. And we're going to see the grief shown in the fact that it's very densely textured. All the voices are going to be singing at the same time. They are going to be doing independent lines. Another thing I forgot to mention when I talk about how you can use the tone row, you may use it linearly, where you're representing a melody using the tone row, or you can share it among several voices and create chords. And in the first section, we have none of that. So all of the voices are alone in their own representations of the hexachords, and basically mourning in exile, if you will, not sharing anything as you go through that. Also, the melodic use of that tritone that we showed at the end of that first hexachord is going to give that sense of mourning as well. In this section, all you will see is hexachords. There is no complete tone row statement and no use of retrograde, of the backwards statements either. So that takes us to building the new shore. And as we go to the new shore, again, there is no mention of God here, so there's no use of palindromes or P7. And here, instead of the hexachords that we had before, we're going to have complete row statements of the retrograde inversion of 0, retrograde 7, and an inversion of 0, and we're going to flip to more of an A-flat tonal center. What we're going to see here is a movement more towards consonants and stability. So again, we're building the new shore. We want to have the building blocks put in place. We want a little more stability as we go through there. And so when he does use the inversion of 0, he's going to minimize the tritone. Where it shows up in the soprano line, he's going to put a rest between where the tritone is going to happen. We're also going to see a change from linear to vertical row presentations. And let me show you a little bit of how that is going to work here. And it almost looks literally like some building blocks as we go through here. So when we start out with the building of the new shore, got to remember I can do this from here. Let's go green. So here you've got one row being shared between bass and tenor. As we move along, and the others are doing the entire row statements, when we get to here, and now I'm going to erase it. Oh, actually, no, I don't need to erase that. I can just put it there. We now have 3 voices that are sharing a tone row, tenor, alto. And at the very end of that, and I will erase this now, we have all 4 voices. So we've got to build up from the alto, tenor and bass sharing a tone row, then adding the alto to that, and then adding the soprano. So again, adding to that idea of building, as we look through that. In addition, we've got that repetition at the end where all 4 voices are sharing the tone row. And this is our first text repetition, and it's the Neue Uferland, so the new shore, if you will. And this is the only complete row presentation between all 4 voices in the entire piece. There's no other time that we're going to see that. What we are going to see is the way he sets up the tone row creates sort of a whole tone scale or blocks. And for a whole tone scale is, whereas the 12-tone row is based on half steps, the whole tone is based on whole steps, of which, by the way, there are 6 tones in the whole tone scale. But again, so it means that between each step is an equal amount, an equal pitch difference. And so that, again, kind of adds the idea of building blocks, that you're building blocks as you go through this. So let's take a look at how this looks on that cadence. So if you're looking at this, you've got the build up here. This will start our whole tone scale in the tenor 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 is a numerical representation of the whole tone scale. And you may be saying to yourself, well, what about that note? Where does that come into it? Well, that allows not only a horizontal representation of 0, 2, 4, or a linear representation of 0, 2, 4, 6, but also a vertical representation of 2, 4, 6, 0, 2, 4, 6. And add to that, for those of you who are music majors, what are our intervals that we have between the A and the E and then the B? A to E, perfect fifth, E to D,
perfect fourth.
Perfect fourth. So here, all of a sudden, he's using those very strong fundamental intervals that we use in tonal music in that soprano line to kind of put the final nail into the foundation of the new shore, if you will, in addition to adding those building blocks up. Does that all make sense? Yes, no, maybe. And so there again, that's just kind of showing that cadence. So how that sounds then is you've got in the bass, in the tenor, is that whole tone scale, and then the sopranos add that, which adds that fifth and the fourth as we go through that. So then we end up with the return of God in the final section of the piece and in the final stanza. And again, we're going to see reappearances of the hexachords. He's going to start pulling in all of the elements of this time when we're mourning the destruction of the temple, the time we're building the new shore, into the return of God. We'll see the hexachords. They're going to be modified slightly. In fact, in some places, he's just going to use 4 of the 6 notes from that. And he may actually divide the hexachords between voices, so it's no longer just in the single soprano line, as we saw there. The palindromes are going to come back, as well as this idea of the G-C pitch centers that we were talking about. Now, unique to this section is actually this is the only section of music where he offers any dynamic markings or articulation markings. he also is going to take this palindrome and he's going to create a canon or a round, kind of row, row, row your boat, if you will. Between them, you'll see it between the tenors and the basses using the same melody that the sopranos were using at the beginning, only inverted. And then he's going to also use one later on between the sopranos and altos, only using the retrograde hexachords, if you go through that. So when you hear that at the end, and I'm kind of show it to you a little bit here, as we get into, so again, you can see we finally have some dynamic markings here, and the staccato markings on the notes as we go through that. And you're then going to have the canon between the bass and the tenor, and it actually will start with the tenor. Sorry, I think I misplayed one of those, but that's the idea. And then you have another canon going on between the soprano and the alto, and again, it's going to have that more A flat, that and perfect fifth feeling that we would look for there as we go through that. Again, we're going to see culmination of things from the previous sections. This is going to be the length of the section is going to be much longer as we go through here. This is the only section where he actually uses all of the rows that he employs in this piece. We're going to have both linear, so melodic, as well as chordal presentations of the rows. And again, he's going to minimize the tone, the tritone, if you will. So as you can see here, and that's a little stretched, he actually takes a spot where he takes the initial hexachord, but he doesn't want the tritone. So he just repeats the first four notes, taking out the tritone at the very end, and he repeats it 3 times, and the last time he does it with a palindrome. And he does the same thing in the bass line as well. He just takes the first 4 notes. And so where, might you ask, does the tritone from inversion 0A and P7A end up? They end up in the alto and tenor lines. The P7A tritone ends up between the alto and the tenor. Then he goes to the I0A tritone and finally the P7A tritone again. So again, you kind of have a little bit of a palindrome of tritones that are sort of squished in the middle so that maybe you don't notice that they're there. But I suspect you will. Lastly, I want to talk about sort of the symbolism of some of the pitch class sets that he uses. And this is what he's really going to use to represent the new Shore, to represent God. Pitch class sets are sort of the building blocks of post-tonal music. They're sort of collections of pitches that create some sort of a motive. And again, they're shorter than the 12 tones. In this case, they're just going to be 4 notes in length, 4 pitches in length, if you will. And they can be represented, again, both melodically, linearly, as well as vertically. We already talked about the new Shore and the idea we've got this sort of whole tone collection. The entire whole tone collection, again, is 6 pitches, which we talked also about the importance of the number 6. Now, here's where God comes in. God is represented by the whole tone collection, or excuse me, by the hexatonic collection, and it is going to be the numbers 0, 1, 4, 5. If we take those pitches that we said were so key at the beginning, the G going to the B natural, going to the C, back to the A flat, which were the beginning and ending pitches of those initial hexachords. That's technically 7, do math, 11, 0, 8. as far as how it falls on the half steps. If you put those in an order where they've got the least amount of distance between them, you end up with G, A flat, trust me on this, B, and C. So you then have 7, 8, 11, 0. If you take this all down to 0, take 7 off of each one, you end up with 0, 1, 4. So if you're wondering how we're getting to that, that's how we get to it. That's 0, 1, 4, 5. And again, it's showing that relationship. Hexatonic scales are kind of cool. Again, they're made up of 6 notes. And if I play it correctly, and I will try my best to play it correctly, it kind of sounds like something I've heard in the 60s Star Trek in the background. So let's see if I can play this correctly. Sorry. So it's got kind of that Star Trek-y feeling to it. So I guess it's appropriate that God should be out in space somewhere. You go through that. So that's sort of the 6-note collection that is used for that. Now, you might say, how is it that we necessarily know that God is 0, 1, 4, 5? That's a good answer if you're ever having a trivia question. What is the number for God? 0, 1, 4, 5. Thank you very much. You can go along with the Hitchhiker's Guide of yes. At any rate, part of the reason is it comes from that P7 collection, which we said only appears in those 2 sections that talk about God. It also is only shown actually twice in the work. The first time it's done linearly in the melody of the I'm not playing that correctly. But again, it's these notes that we're talking about that we see in that melody. The fact that they're spread apart and not put right together during that time sort of shows about the elusiveness of God, the fact that he's missing at that point. And is being mourned for. So that's where we see it, is in that first section, in that melodic line at the beginning and the ending of phrases. And the only other time we see it is the very last chord of the piece. And there it is done vertically. It's done as a final chord, as if the finality says, okay, God has arrived. This is strengthened. Oh, let me talk about sort of, we've got kind of, these 2 sets are both symmetrical as well. 0, 2, 4, 6. And so sort of like the palindromes, if you put the axis down, or the axis line down through here, and this is for God, 0, 1, 4, 5, you can see that it spreads out equally on either sides of the axis. So it too, in some ways, is a palindrome, in the fact that it'll go 0, 1, you twist on the axis, and then go back up to 4, 5. And that kind of twisting and moving forward sort of allows a sense of the fact that there's a bit of evolution and growth here as you go through that. The same thing can be seen with the whole tone scale that is representing the building of the new shore, if you will. You've got your axis in a slightly different spot. But again, you have an equal representation around the outside of that. So as we get to the very end of the piece, while the use of these 2 symmetrical sets works very nicely for representing the new shore and God and gives a very positive image of that, in addition to that, we are going to see elements of human struggle in each of these sections. It's going to be most noticeable in the first section, and it's going to lessen as we go along. In the very first section, where we have the longing for God, the use of the tritone so extensively is going to show that idea, again, of a little bit of conflict. But while we have P7A and I0A being used in the melody and in the tenor and the soprano line, we're going to see a different hexachord used in the alto bass lines, which actually is going to center around that A-flat pitch center. So while you've got the other voices in that G-C pitch center, they're going to kind of throw in this contrasting, conflicting pitch center, which again, Morning God, you're kind of expecting that sort of grief, if you will, going through that. In Building the New Shore, the bass line actually concludes with a different whole tone scale than the other three. So again, we've got a voice that's just a little bit out of whack there, if you will. And finally, in The Return of God, and I guess it's always with the basses who are going to be the conflicting voice here, it is the only voice that does not share or present an entire hexachord. The other three voices will share that final hexachord. He actually decides to go off on his own and present another one. And again, that kind of just suggests that there's still a little bit of struggle going on through there. That first section, overcoming doubts and struggles, perhaps a loss of faith, and maybe that kind of represents Schoenberg's loss of faith there for a while before he went back. And again, it lessens over each section. Now this brings us to sort of the final cadential progression or timeline. And this is resolving the longing for God, establishing a new shore, and the actual return of God. There are 3 points. He pulls the 3 symbols that are so important throughout this work together in this final cadence. And I'll show you. Previously, there are going to be 3 chords that are actually going to be G dominant chords, which again you're going to expect to resolve to, in this case we're in a minor key, you're going to expect it to resolve to minor. And we're going to, I'll show you that to you in the full score when we go through and listen, but here we're going to actually see that resolution. So the resolution of the morning of God. We've resolved that. Then we are able to go ahead and build the new shore. Here is 0, 2, 4, 6. And then finally, the return of God. So it creates this wonderful cadence that resolves sort of each section of the piece, with the idea that without overcoming our doubts or struggles within ourselves or with each other, we may not recognize the return of God, and that we need to, and that in this case, he's looking at resolving that initial mourning of the loss of God, and by being able to do that, we are then able to build a new shore, and upon completion of that, God will return, is sort of what he is implying as we go through here, and that's the way he pulls it all together. Now, I'm going to actually play the entire piece for you. Again, it's relatively short. It's about 2.5 minutes. All of this stuff I've talked about, with the exception possibly of the palindromes and that initial soprano melody, you will not be able to hear. It's, again, this type of composition tends to be a very sort of intellectual exercise, and it is so neat to actually delve into it and see all this, because he did this all very purposefully. There was a great purpose in what he did, but when you actually listen to it, you're not necessarily going to be able to hear the elements. But I do have a full score that I will put up there, and hopefully with some of my markings and all of that, it will help you to hear what's going on there. So let's go back to our absence. Oops. introducing you to a little bit of Arnold Schoenberg, and sort of how his compositional process works. And again, reflecting later in his life, his return to Judaism, the return of the Jewish people to a state of Israel, as we go through that. So, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you coming out tonight. And do you have any questions? Uh-oh, Dr. Schultz is sitting behind
So actually, I'm curious if Schoenberg doesn't use any dynamics until that return. Does that make for some different interpretations of that opening?
I think it does allow you to do different interpretations. I think the fact that the texture is so dense at the beginning will automatically lend itself to perhaps a slightly heavier dynamic setting. Then in the second, it will start out with a slightly sparser texture.
Was I right? There was nothing.
No, there's
okay.
absolutely no markings whatsoever up till that final section. So yeah, it does lead itself to interpretation, and maybe the fact that there's nothing to totally rejoice up to that point. And I think the fact that he adds the staccatos there kind of give it a more bell-like quality. So, yeah. Yes, sir?
Do you know much about the premiere of the piece?
Unfortunately, I do not. I do not. In fact, I'm not even sure if it was premiered before he passed or not. But I know it was part of he did 3 final choral works. This and a De Profundis, and I can't think of the third one off the top of my head.
And he did this just because he didn't get, this wasn't a commission?
No, and I was going to say at this point I think he did this for himself. At this point he would have been out of teaching for about 7 or 8 years now at this point. So no, I think that he did this for himself.
Have you had the privilege of being a part of this?
Yes, I've had the privilege. Yes, I sang it with one of the groups that I was with in New York. Actually, as we did a concert of all Schoenberg repertoire.
Can you form an opinion about the reception of this composition? Or
I think the reception of this is very good. As atonal works go and as 12-tone works go, this in some ways is more accessible than, obviously you hear the dissonances, you hear the fact that it's not cadencing quite the way you're expecting it to. There doesn't seem to be necessarily a logical progression. But all in all, because of the fact that I think there are some tonal structures set up and how he set up the tone row and how he manipulates them, I think there is a little bit of a sense of something that you can grasp onto that seems somewhat familiar. So I think it is more accessible than a lot of his works. Anybody else?
What inspired you to present on this?
It's, as I said, it's a piece I've performed before that just fascinated me. And actually, I performed it before I ever went back to grad school. So when I went back to grad school and I started learning all about this post-tonal theory and all of that, I decided, well, I'd like to really see what made this piece tick, because it kind of clicked with me when I performed it. But I didn't, and I kind of understood as we were learning the piece how the rows were working. But I didn't really have a total understanding of it, and when I went back to grad school and started to get some of the tools on how to deal with post-tonal theory, I said, well, let's take a look at this and pull it apart and see what all's in there. And so much more was in there than I ever expected when I first started with it. So, and so it's in some ways a labor of love, because I realize this isn't necessarily everybody's cup of tea, and it gets into some very deep theoretical concepts and things like that. But I'm hoping that you all at least kind of took away sort of the gist and the important things of what he was trying to do with this piece. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Did Schoenberg write much on this piece? Did you find much?
No, I did not find much on this piece. As I said, he wrote it later, just a couple of years before he died, and so there's not a whole, there are a few mentions of it, but not nearly as much as I would have liked, because I really would have liked to have been able to pick his brain a little bit and know a little bit more of what his more of what his, I mean, I can kind of see some of his rationale here, but what his personal reasons and feelings were behind this piece.
Are there some additional works besides the choral works from this era, so to speak, of the genre?
He's got the choral works. There is, and I can't think, I know he's got, it's an instrumental, I know there's an instrumental piece around this time. Survivor from Warsaw is actually from this time. It's a little bit earlier, but it's from this time period. Survivor from Warsaw is also from this time period, which is a cantata, for those of you who may not know, it's a cantata for orchestra, a narrator, and a men's choir. And it's based on text from a survivor from the Warsaw ghettos during the Nazi regime. And that occurred. Again, and it is like he seems to have had a moment of reflection where he really is doing a lot of religious works.
How long was he a Lutheran?
Well, let's see. From 1898 to 1933. So about 35 years. So actually the majority of his life. But you know, he was obviously very disturbed by what was going on in Europe at that time, and felt the need to go back to his faith. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it.